Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming, everybody, to the 2022. It's not working? How about that? All right, I'll see if I can. I'll make like a rock star. How's that? Okay. So anyway, thank you for coming. You're really nice to do it. And Lisa reminded me that we are YouTubing this, and we will have this on the website to see later. So in case there are just incredibly moving moments you want to revisit, please do. I really just wanted to say we're going to plunge right into our program because there's some things we need to get through business-wise before we get to Robert Shetterly, who will tell us about the kind of people who are in distressingly short supply these days. But I first wanted to thank you as the members for all you've done for a great year where I was looking at the minutes Howard Lowell did, and we had just emerged from the worst of COVID. And the amount of stuff that has been done so successfully this year is just so impressive with the Clark Fitzgerald exhibit, the House and Garden Tour, programmatically engaging with the school on a program for kids on history in Castine. You know, I could go on and on. I'm not going to, so you're safe. But we have our committee chairs for that to lead you through what we've been up to. But first, I'd like to, if I could, get a motion to approve the annual minutes, which I know you've all read from last year, if you haven't memorized them. And so if someone would like to propose a motion, a second? Okay, any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Done. So to start off our battery of committee chairs to tell you what was up over the last year, I'm going to start with John Mitchell, and then we're going to do it tag team wise, and he'll introduce the next, and pretty soon Robert Shetterly will be in front of you. So, but we do actually, I should mention, have to do a vote before that on board members who are re-upping and also on some great new board members we're getting on. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm John Mitchell, and can you hear me? Yeah, I'm okay. And I promised Lisa that this would be brief, and it will be. I will not go on and on. I think 2021 was another challenging year for the Historical Society because most of the COVID restrictions were still in place, so it required a lot of changes in budgets and budget, excuse me, and budgets. But in the end, the actual income exceeded the budgeted amount, and the actual expenses were less than the budgeted amount. So the net result was a positive operating income, which was in a challenging year, that was very definitely a plus. And at your convenience, please review the final report, the year-end report, which I think has been distributed or being distributed. The Finance Committee, with the board approval, initiated a significant reduction in the Grindle House mortgage. The end result being a significant savings in interest paid, as well as reducing the debt termination by more than 4 years. Bangor Savings Bank Wealth Management, with Finance Committee's oversight, continues to manage the Society's endowment funds. 2021 overall was a good year. Not so much this year. As a result of the market volatility, This year's funds, we suffered significant losses in the first 3-4 months of the year. But management of the funds remained within the benchmarks established by the Society in the investment policy statement. The Finance Committee, along with the board, will continue to monitor the endowment's progress. Things have been getting better. We hope that it will continue that way. This year, with a very successful house and garden tour, the resumption of regular hours at the Society, and the Clark Fitzgerald exhibit, the Society is on much more solid ground. Thank you. And I would like to introduce the next speaker, Brooke Tenney, head of the exhibit committee. Hey, Brooke.
Thank you, John. Last fall, the exhibit committee dismantled the risky business exhibit, which had a successful 2-year run. This winter was spent preparing for the Clark Fitzgerald Castine Celebrated Sculptor in Residence exhibit. Carl Little, art historian and author of art books, was the guest curator for the exhibition, which was funded in part through 2 grants from the Maine Arts Commission. Thank you, Lisa, for your proposal writing skills. The response to the Clark Fitzgerald exhibition was very positive, with many visitors asking if we would have the same exhibit next year. There are many more examples of Clark Fitzgerald's work to be shown, so I'm glad to be able to tell you that we listened to our visitors. Next year, we will have a refreshed Clark Fitzgerald exhibit. It is my pleasure to introduce Jules Thompson, the Castine Historical Society Collections Manager. She will present the collections report for the Collections Committee Chair, Richard Ames, who is not able to be with us today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Brooke, for that and for introducing me. I think Brooke said I'm the new collections manager, and I'm reading this in the stead of Richard Ames, who helpfully provided the outline, and I fleshed it out a little bit, hopefully in a way that he will approve of. So first I want to talk about what the Collections Committee and the collections staff have done in terms of digital upgrades, which is perhaps our most significant recent area of expansion, although a lot of it did occur behind the scenes, so you may not have heard of it. The last couple of years, COVID notwithstanding, have seen a big push toward digital preservation and digital access at the Historical Society. And this began a while back with a switchover of our in-house collections database, Past Perfect 5. Not that you need to know the name, but that is the name of it. We switched to an online version, Past Perfect Web Edition. And that switchover was actually very important. Switching over to the online version had a lot of benefits, including easier remote access for staff, secure offsite backup of our collection records and image files, and an easier incorporation of a public-facing online catalog, which has been one of our biggest goals over the last couple of years. And I'm pleased to say that we do now have a public collections catalog that was launched in April of this year. We haven't advertised it too extensively yet. We've just started doing that, but you can find a link on the Historical Society website. Patrons and researchers from anywhere in the world theoretically now can browse our archival and photographic collections to help them track down what they need. As a side note, this is the same public catalog used by the Penobscot Marine Museum, the Bangor Historical Society, the Abbey Museum, and the Maine Maritime Museum, among other museums. So we're in good company there. And in 2021, we had more people donate items to the collection than ever before, which my predecessor page knows all too well. It's a positive in many ways. but it also has added to our backlog of materials to process, so that's just a bit of extra work there, but some good stuff in it as well. In 2021, we acquired a beautiful painting of the ship Castine in port in Trieste, painted in 1892 by Bazi Ivankovic, I think is how you say his name. And we also had several large donations, including over 30 daguerreotypes and ambrotype photographs depicting members of the Whiting, Whitney, Jarvis, and Hatch families, and a large collection of Westcott family archives and objects dating back to the mid-1800s. And thank you respectively to Richard Ames and Elizabeth Ames MacDonald and to Anne Westcott Dodd for those donations, among many others. And finally, there's been a steady push on policy and documentation work in the committee. They contributed to the recent update of the strategic plan, and they also reviewed the updated disaster preparedness plan with a view toward preservation of the collections in a disaster situation. One of the main upshots there is that the collections database is now cloud-based, thanks to that upgrade to the Past Perfect Web Edition, and that is highly protective against data loss, so we can all sleep a little better at night knowing that. The committee has also been reviewing and amending its own policy documents, starting with the collections management policy, and that's been significantly redrafted by Howard Lowell in consultation with the rest of the committee, and that will be reviewed by the board at their next meeting. And that is all from me. That was quite a lot of information. I hope you were able to absorb it. I will now hand you over to Mark Pelletier, who will give you the report for buildings and grounds. Thank you.
Good afternoon. The first thing I'd like to do is thank the members of the Buildings and Grounds Committee, Jim Day, Ewan Farnham, Roger Moss, Marcia Mason, Pedrick Sweet, and 3 new members this year, Charlie Pierce, Steve Skillen, and Steve Leeser. I have a very short report. As you know, we're responsible for the upkeep, maintenance, and improvements to our properties. And during COVID time, we didn't do much of anything. But over the past year, we cleaned the Grindle house. There was a fair amount of mold growing on it. We had to partially repair the roof around the belfry at Abbott School. We took apart the front doors to Abbott School in an attempt to restore them. Let me put it this way. We patched them up and put them back together, and we will have to replace them after many, many years. And by the way, they're not original. Biggest job that we had this year was designing, fabricating, and installing all of the support pedestals, shelving, niches, et cetera, and then painting everything needed for the Clark Fitzgerald exhibit. That was a lot of fun. I had a great time. And my favorite job, putting in memorial bricks. It's thrilling. And the best part is weed control. That's what we get to do. And that's it. Who am I introducing next? Oh, yeah, the agenda right here. Here it is. Here. Hi, Alice. Alice Alston is next. Thank you.
He's a lot taller than me. How can it come down? There. Okay, can you hear me now? I am obviously reporting for the Education Committee, which is a wonderful group of assorted people who work in that part of our endeavor. We have pretty much 3 charges that we're doing. The first and really important one is to support and stand behind the volunteers who make the exhibit happen, the docents and the walking tour guides. The docents, over there, some 40 of them, who have been led this year amazingly by Dabney McKenzie, and the team of the walking tour guides, equally led by Lori Butler this year. This year, we came back to a full 7-day schedule in the exhibits with docents, and so we always need more and would love to have you turn up. The walking tours, we cut back a little bit this time because with the pandemic, at least not so bad, we had the exhibit open, and so we had 3 days of the week where we had a morning tour. And we had lots of other tours that people requested, and the staff frequently do that as well as our guides. The second of our, and this is a fun thing, of our charges is to support Lisa and the staff in talking and discussing and thinking about programs that we're going to have. I'm really proud that our committee suggested Robert Shetterly for today, and he's here. And on Saturday at 2 o'clock at the Alamo, there will be a filming of a screening of a film about him. So come, 2 o'clock on Saturday as well as today. The third of our projects, which George mentioned earlier, which is really much in my heart, is working with the educational institutions around, in particular the Adams School, to help them to use the resources of the Historical Society. In particular, we have Heather Trainer, who is a member of our committee and the 3rd and 4th grade teacher over there. So our job right now, which we're just finishing up, is developing a packet, a curriculum packet for her to use with her 3rd and 4th graders about occupations in Castine in the early 19th century. And for each of these occupations, for instance, teaching or sea captaining or shipbuilding or rope making or, hat making is the one I'm thinking about right now. For each of those, we have found in the archives information about a person, an individual who did that. John Dresser for the ropes, the Hawes sisters for the teaching. And so we will give these packets. The hardest thing, as you can imagine, is after you write this stuff up, then you look at it and say, a 3rd grader couldn't think about this, couldn't use it. So you have to rewrite and rewrite to get that down, so that each of them will take one of these people and occupations, and it becomes their project to put it in their words and say, well, I am Lucinda Parker. And so we will come back to you guys and share a lot more when we get this done. And so that's where I am, and would like to turn it over to Lisa Hogan for development.
Hello, everyone. As I have stated in the past, my committee, the Development Committee, has the most fun. And this past year, we really had a great time, and we had a lot of success. We were very busy, and I'll start with membership. As the membership is the backbone of any organization, it has been bolstered this year, and we had outreach efforts that we made to newcomers, and as well as new, fresh connections with community members through the House and Garden Tour. So I'm happy to report that we have over 50 new membership households. So that's great. In addition to membership income, we do count on grant funding, and our executive director was successful this year in securing funding from 2 grants from the Maine Arts Commission for the exhibition. And our gift shop also provides an important income stream, and it continues to have interesting casting connected items, so don't forget to check it out in person or online. It's a great time to do some early holiday shopping. And now to report on the barn burner of the year, the Castine House and Garden Tour. This once every 4-year event is our biggest fundraiser. The income generated by this year's wildly successful tour was well beyond our expectations. The proceeds that go into our money market account will, in part, help support future projects that are meaningful to the community, such as the educational curriculum that Alice was talking about with the project with the Adams School. And this year we had record ticket sales with over 1,000 attendees, and the town was bustling with enthusiastic visitors who often remarked on the quality of the tour. Planning and execution of this event was a monumental undertaking with no less than 200 volunteers, including many of you in this very room. Your time, your effort, and your generosity helped make this success possible. Under the expert leadership, once again, of Ruth Scheer, along with Lynn Dearborn and Mary Dearborn. And the Castine Historical Society is so grateful for all of your collective efforts, and you deserve not only to spike the ball in the end zone, but also a huge round of applause. In closing, I wish to mention our fall annual appeal and the fact that 27% of our membership make this additional year-end gift that is crucial to our general operating budget. Last year's appeal exceeded our goal, and we are confident that we can do even better this year. We certainly have great momentum to do exciting things in the year ahead. Thank you all so much for your vital and continued support. And now we will hear from Lisa Simpson-Lutz with the Executive Director's Report. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Since our last annual meeting, this has been a year of administrative changes at CHS, especially in the area of staffing. One thing I quickly learned as a museum director over the past 30 years is that staffing changes are inevitable, and while disruptive during the transition, can lead to exciting, positive developments for the institution. In August of last year, we said goodbye to our office manager, Angela Bonacasa, and in March of this year, welcomed Mary DeRost in that position. Many of you know Mary through her 18 years at the Castine Inn. We are delighted to work with Mary, who, after only a few months working with us, did a stellar job of managing, no lie, 1 million little details about the House and Garden Tour, and all beautifully done. Toward the end of 2021, our longtime curator, Paige Lilly, announced her intent to go back to consulting work. In January of 2022, we hired Paige back with a 6-month contract to continue to work on the collection. Also in January, we welcomed our new collections manager, Jules Thompson. Paige and Jules were able to work together for those 6 months, which was an excellent orientation period for Jules. Jules has jumped into her work at CHS and notably completed a task we have long wanted, making our collections management system viewable to the general public. We are excited to see what other initiatives Jules will bring to CHS. Often, it's hard for our members to realize what goes on behind the scenes with the staff, especially during the winter. I know a lot of people say to me, "Do you go to Florida?" No, I do. We all work year-round, and there's a lot we have to do in the winter to plan to get ready for the season. So things such as working on exhibits, working on the collection, program development, advertising, those are just some of the things that we do over the winter. For myself, last winter, because we were without Paige in that role, I stepped in and worked a lot on the Clark Fitzgerald exhibit, which was a lot of fun. We worked with guest curator Carl Little, our exhibit advisor, Stephan Fitzgerald, and members of the exhibits and the buildings and grounds crew. The result, which I'm sure you've all seen, is a fabulous exhibit on Castine's Clark Fitzgerald. And as Brooke said, the result has been that we have decided to keep it over for a second year, but refreshed with many, many new pieces of sculpture. The attendance in the exhibitions have been great. We had our highest attendance in 2019 pre-COVID with Risky Business. We are very close to that number, but I'm not sure we're going to make the 2019 attendance, but very, very close. We are, as we said, we're open now daily, back to the old schedule, which has been wonderful to get back into that routine. This spring and early summer, the staff had the extra layer of work of the House and Garden Tour on top of everything else. But it was great fun working on the project. We did everything from public relations, a lot of ad placements, pre-selling over 600 tickets online and in person, which you can imagine took a huge amount of time, most of it Mary's. I can't thank the staff enough for their hard work during that time period, which enabled the event to be so organized and successful. We did have a lot of other programs to do besides the House and Garden Tour. This year we had a jewelry lecture and appraisal day. We had the Stephen Fitzgerald talk, the Pulliam lecture, and of course tonight's talk. And as Alice mentioned, Saturday at 2 o'clock at the Alamo Theater, we will be screening Truth Tellers, which is the documentary about Robert Shetterly's work. So I always want to thank you as our members for all your continued support of the Historical Society over the past year. Your good wishes, your attendance at exhibits and events, your financial support has been invaluable to help us grow and prosper as the Castine Historical Society. Now somebody took the agenda and I don't know who I'm introducing. Ellie, okay. Next up is Ellie, who is head of the governance committee, and she will be giving that report. And I'll bring an agenda up for you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It was a busy time for the governance committee this past year. We had a lot of housekeeping things to do. So we reviewed all the policies and brought the personnel policies as well as all of the other things that keep us working up to date. We reviewed the old strategic plan to see where we were. And it seems that we had finished as much as we could do of the strategic plan. And we then set about a new strategic plan, which you will hear more about this coming year. We spent quite a bit of time vetting potential new board members. We have 5 members leaving the board, so that would leave a pretty big hole. So after vetting all of those, we came down to this. The term of 2 board members has to be over based on our rules of the road. And they are George Hatch, who has been our president, and Bill Buchanan, who has been a vital part of the finance committee. George was head of governance for as long as I could remember. I really don't know how long, so I don't want to say. And then this last year, he served as our president. We will miss him. We hope he will stay engaged. Bill has been on the finance committee for a long time. He's the person who was responsible for lowering the interest and renegotiating the loan on the Grindle House, which has made a significant difference in our monthly outflows. In addition, Bill keeps his eye on our investments so that they are giving off as much income as they can, for which we are very, very grateful. He has agreed to stay on the finance committee, and that gives me just a big relief. So thank you, George, and thank you, Bill, for your service and all you've done for us. Okay, I'm going to turn this back over to George.
All right, we're really moving. Let's see here. So we have two things to vote on and one I'd like to tell you about. The first item to vote on would be new members of the board, and we have three wonderful, I'd say genuinely new in two cases, not new in the other. But because of term limits, we allow a kind of reprise for some board members if they take a year off. And so that group's person is Susie Hatch, who's coming back, and who I will give away. We would like to vote tomorrow as a board to be the next president. And we also have Brittany Getting and Charlie Pierce, who are genuinely new board members, but not new to the Historical Society. As you heard from Mark, Charlie's been working away on buildings and grounds, and Brittany has been involved in so many different ways. She was an intern, she got her doctorate, she came back and helped with the Castine Partners, Historical Partners, to help plan the virtual tour. And we're so excited that we have this blend of new blood and institutional memory, which was our hope when we did the first strategic plan, to have these cohorts of a mixed nature like that. And so we're really happy with these three. And so if someone would like to move those three as new board members, I'd entertain it. Who's that? Ruth. Okay, I need to say that for Mary because she's keeping. Mark, second? Okay, cool. Any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Done. Great. Congratulations. So the next thing is to re-up three board members who have been just fantastic. And when I say re-up, I just can't resist saying that Ellie and I were corresponding on whether they'd agree to a second term. And these are Richard Ames, Mary Dearborn, and Howard Lowell. And so we were corresponding, and Ellie reported to me, because of spell check sabotaging her message, that these three have agreed to reupholster. and I don't want to scare them off, but we are not insisting on that. But if you want to try it, that would be fine. At any rate, Richard Ames, Mary Dearborn, and Howard Lowell, if you vote yes, would get another 3-year term. So any motion for that? Ellie. Second? Who's the second? Oh, how are you doing, John? Nice to see you. John Parrish seconds. All in favor? Any opposed? Done. So the third thing I need to report, but I've already sort of blown the novelty of it, was to tell you that Susie Hatch has agreed to be president, and because of our bylaws insistence on the board doing the officer selection, we're going to do that tomorrow by email. But I just wanted to let you know that that's who we're hoping to elect president. And then otherwise, we're going to stick with the group we got, which is VP Howard Lowell, Secretary Lisa Hogan, and John Mitchell as treasurer. So thank you very much.
Okay, right on time. This is wonderful. So we are going to move now into our program. So each year during our annual meeting, we invite a guest speaker to talk about an aspect of history or culture related to Castine. And as Alice said, as we were brainstorming this year, the Education Committee thought it would be really interesting to have a contemporary artist from the area, because it would relate to the Clark Fitzgerald exhibit. And the first person everybody thought of was Robert Shetterly. Rob is from Brooksville, and he very graciously agreed to speak and to come back on Saturday for the Alamo truth-telling video or documentary. So Robert graduated in 1969 from Harvard with a degree in English literature. And at Harvard, he said he took courses in drawing, which changed the direction of his creative life. He went from the written word to the image. And in 1970, after college, he moved to Maine, assuming to Brooksville. I don't know if you lived other places? Okay, other places besides here, but he wised up and he moved here. An exhibition of the portraits that he has been painting, actually more than two. He brought more than two today. The ones that you see here today have traveled to over 30 states. In 2005, Dutton published a book of the portraits by the same name. The following year, that book won the top award for the International Reading Association for Intermediate Nonfiction. Currently, New Village Press is publishing a series of theme-based books on the portraits. Portraits of Racial Justice came out last year, and next month, Portraits of Earth Justice will be published. We hope following the talk that you will visit the parish hall where we're having a reception, and you can meet Rob. He will be selling and signing copies of these books. So without any further ado, I am going to introduce our speaker, Rob Shetterly.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you all for being here. I've lived in Hancock County 52 years. I was first in Gouldsboro, I've been in Surrey and Blue Hill, and now, for the most part, in Brooksville. You mean louder sound? Okay, I'll talk louder. Talk right into it, okay. Thank you very much. So I think I'm supposing that there are some people here who have not heard me talk before or heard much talk about what this project is all about, so I need to give you a little brief history. I'm a self-taught painter. My first 11 years in Maine, I raised my kids in the woods in Gouldsboro off the grid, and at night, by kerosene light, I would copy drawings by Leonardo and various other people, the etchings or the woodcuts of Durer and the etchings of Goya, who was probably the biggest influence on me of any of those people. It was a long, hard slog for me to get to a place where I could support myself as an artist, and it was not as a portrait artist. Until 20 years ago, I had never painted a realistic portrait. I found my voice really as a surrealist and was exceedingly happy in the world and thought that that was my responsibility, really, to present mystery and ambiguity to people and let other people's imagination and experience try to fill in whatever they thought it might mean. That was my job, was to explore those areas. I mean, in the same way that, you know, my relationship to truth, if we can talk about that, was not, you know, to say what one should think about history or about responsibility in terms of legal action or anything like that. My sense was about truth was it's very complicated. I mean, that's why we write novels, is to explore all the many facets of why anybody does anything. And I was fascinated with that. And I tried to use especially etching and then painted etchings and drawings and then paintings to explore all the different reasons, or all I could think of, the reasons why we do anything, basically. That all changed for me in right after 9/11. And it was not 9/11 itself that caused that change. It was, I mean, there are people in this room who have been aware of the history of this country as long as I have, maybe even a little bit longer. And what we saw right after 9/11 was the immediate attempt of the Bush government to use that event to enable the attack on the country of Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. did not have weapons of mass destruction, had no connection with Al-Qaeda, had not been involved in attacking the Twin Towers. You know, all of these claims were made by our government repeatedly and repeatedly with a great deal of hoopla and especially fear that somehow this country that had been under sanctions and was desperately poor, all of its infrastructure destroyed, you know, 500,000 children having died, you know, from malnutrition and disease during that period of the sanctions, was somehow going to launch an attack on the United States. You know, it was absurd, but we were bombarded with this information and made to fear that this actually could happen. And actually, as Howard Zinn said, you know, everybody's government lies, and that's true. But the thing that really let down this country during that period was not so much that the government was lying, it was that our major media failed to report it. You know, they were aware that this was not the truth, and instead they, you know, cheerleaded for this, you know, for that war. Wars are very popular in this country, and, you know, they make an awful lot of money for some people. Well, I was, at that time, you know, living here in Brooksville and getting more and more distressed that this was actually going to happen, that they were going to get away with it. You know, and I just couldn't, I had an enormous variety of reactions. One was that I should leave this country. I just couldn't stand that this was happening again in my lifetime, another war being fought for illegitimate reasons. And I thought, no, I really shouldn't leave. You know, what I should do is devote myself entirely to objecting to what's going on and try to find some way to have a voice at this moment, you know, even if it's a paltry little voice, at least one that makes me feel less alienated from the country. And unfortunately, my guiding emotions at this time, you know, were rage, grief, you know, all these things that are full of energy, but not particularly things that other people want to see. I mean, I have, you know, for 13 years, I did editorial page drawings for the Maine Times newspaper. And I was well aware that people don't like somebody else's anger shoved in their face. And so what I thought was, I've got to find something to do that takes this energy and does something positive with it. And the question was what? You know, and I spent months kind of banging my head, almost literally, against my own studio wall saying, you know, what can I do? What can I do? And then one time I was banging my head right there on the wall, and right in front of me was a quote that I had stuck up there years before from Walt Whitman. It said, "This is what you shall do. Love the earth, the sun, and the animals. Despise riches, hate tyrants, argue not concerning God. Take your hat off to nothing known or unknown," by which he meant there are no hierarchies. And I thought, well, there's something right here that's exceedingly essential about what we want when we talk about democracy, that there are no hierarchies, that all people, all things are essentially equal. And I thought, I'm going to paint a portrait of that man. I mean, I had no idea where this was going to go, but it was just, I was going to paint a portrait of that man and scratch those words into his portrait. And here was the main thing I was thinking, I will feel better. Is I was going to use Walt Whitman to reattach myself to this country. I mean, here was a man who was, you know, maybe one of our greatest essential Democrats. And not only because of what he thought about people, but because he thought that all living things were essentially equal. I mean, he understood in the 19th century what, you know, biologists understand today about the web of life and the relationship of all things, that in order for us to be healthy, we have to have and want the success and the health of everything else that lives on the planet. He understood that. And I did that. I painted this portrait of him. I stuck it up in the foyer to my house. And the first two people who came in the house and saw it burst into tears. And I thought, oh my gosh, I thought I was a better painter than that. But that wasn't it. You know, what they saw was the same thing that I felt, that here was a reattachment to something that we were losing, you know, significantly. And that impressed me enormously, that it spoke that way to just two people who came in the house. And at that point, I thought, I will paint more portraits. And that began something that began, as I said, in a sense as a therapy project, but has now taken over my life and become probably the most meaningful thing I could possibly be doing, with my time. And what I decided to do was, one day I was talking to my partner Gail, who I thought was going to be here, and she's somewhere around, out walking around this beautiful town. She was, I was saying, I think I'm going to paint these portraits. I think I'm going to call them Americans Who Tell the Truth, and then I'm going to give them away. And there was a moment of almost like levitation. I thought, the people I'm going to paint are people who have given something incredibly important to this country. They have never been really repaid for that gift. And for me to sell the paintings itself would not be at all appropriate. I mean, could you imagine painting a portrait of Frederick Douglass and then selling it? Not a good idea. Or, Harriet Tubman or Sojourner Truth, who I'll talk about in a minute. So anyway, that made me feel probably the freest I've ever felt in my life, that I was going to involve myself with the history of this country, find people who have given something really essential through their determination and their courage to trying to make this country be the country it claims to be, and then give the whole collection away to some institution or center that would use them for education and activism. Of course, the next question is, well, who are you going to paint? Who are these Americans who tell the truth? And that's a really interesting question because, right off the bat, I had maybe 5 names. There was Frederick Douglass, there was Harriet Tubman, there was Jane Addams, and Susan B. Anthony, people like that, who had worked in different fields, and tried to make this country a little bit more honest. So I started working through those names, and then what? It's interesting when I told other people, as I said to somebody earlier, when people ask me what I'm doing, I say, I'm painting this project I call Americans Who Tell the Truth. I'd get this blank, incredulous look. There are any? And of course, our history doesn't actually record often the people who do a lot of that important work, or have that kind of courage, or have that kind of determination, especially in the numbers that they're out there. The amazing thing is I've now spent the last 18, 19 years traveling around this country, talking in schools and colleges and museums, is that this country is full of absolutely amazing, dedicated people. I mean, you would, look at the level of political discourse in this country, and then go and visit communities in this country where people are doing great work, to try to protect themselves better about the environment, about racism, about gender issues, about income distribution, all kinds of things that are so important. And you would never have any sense that it's the same country. That the people who are in charge and the level they talk about things don't reflect the quality of the citizens of this country at all. That's my impression after all this time. So what I want to do is actually tell you a few stories about, and I'm going to need some help here turning this on. Oh, here we go. Cool. About some of the people I painted and what they've taught me about our history and our responsibility as citizens. And let's see if I push this. Do I aim it at what do I do? On, off button on the side. I'm sorry. What am I doing? I'm not doing. Oh, there we go. Okay. So let me just talk for a minute. This is one of the very first paintings. This is Sojourner Truth. I'll just tell you some quick stories about these people and why I painted them and what I've learned from them. She was a slave in New York. New York and New Jersey had slavery up until 1827. I mean, just a generation before the Civil War. I mean, we like to sort of break down our history and say, like good guys in the North, bad guys in the South. It really wasn't that way at all. Great fortunes were being made in the North from slavery, from the milling of cotton and the selling of products and the slave trade. slavery was really the biggest economic engine in the United States, and it was profiting not just the South, but the North very much too. And we had slavery in the North. She was a slave. She was she was 30 years old in 1827 when she was finally freed, and she ran away and ran down to New York City. I mean, she was freed, but actually she had escaped a couple years before that. She went to New York City. She was on a farm in upstate New York. Her first language was Dutch, not English. And she got a job working as a domestic in a white woman's house. And this is a woman who was intensely religious, and she had visions. And one day she had this vision. Her name was Isabella Baumfree, was not Sojourner Truth. That was her slave name. And this voice came to her and told her name would be Sojourner. And the very next day, she just walked away. She took the name as her destiny, that she was supposed to now travel. And so she walked away. She had a stick on her back with a rag tied up with a few things she owned. And she started walking, for some reason, east out onto Long Island. She walked until she met somebody a couple of days later who asked her who she was, Sojourner. What's your last name? She didn't have a last name. But that voice came back and gave her the name Truth. And at that point, she decided that the rest of her life she would dedicate to telling the truth about slavery and about women's rights, and that she would travel all over the United States to do that. And she did that. I mean, it was an amazing transformation and epiphany of the importance of a life work and what she could be. I mean, it's so interesting to me that, who we remember, at various times in our history, are not necessarily the people who were the woman who employed her, who was a well-to-do white woman, certainly by comparison to a former slave who had nothing. We don't even know her name. What we know is the name of Sojourner Truth, who dedicated her life to trying to, do something significant, to bring, the words of this country in line with its behavior, the walk and the talk. So in the she became part of that sort of Chautauqua movement of the 19th century, traveling around the country at these events where she would talk for hours with lots of other people on the stage with her, sometimes Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, people like that, Susan B. Anthony, all on the stage together. And she would never learn. She remained illiterate all her life. But she was one of the greatest speakers. And other people followed her around and wrote down what she said. And so each portrait, what I've tried to do is not just paint a portrait of somebody looking right at you with some integrity and concern, but also a quote from that person telling you why they're looking at you like that, and also suggesting to you, maybe if you listen to this, you might think about doing something. That's become the intent of this project, which has really become all about education. But anyway, Sojourner Truth was out in Ohio in the 1850s, still a few years before the Civil War, and she gave this speech where she said, "Now I hears talking about the Constitution and the rights of man. And I comes up and I takes hold of this Constitution, and it's mighty big, and I feels for my rights." It's like the Constitution is a big animal, and she's got her hands on it, and she's feeling around it. And where are my rights, So I feels for my rights, but there ain't any there. And then I says, "God, what ails this Constitution?" And he says to me, "Sojourner, there is a little weasel in it." Well, she was making a joke. But that joke has become kind of the theme of this project, is to chase that weasel, to find everywhere we can the times that this country has, for all the ways that it had, weaseled out of following its own ideals. And it's kind of the people I've painted, although I could start over today. There are now over 260 portraits. I could start over and paint a completely new batch of portraits, and they would tell the same story. Of people trying to make those rights real, those words and ideals real for them when they have been marginalized and left out of the major picture. We talk a lot about today, of course, you hear it, every day in the press is this, these alarms going off about, are we going to lose our democracy? All these attacks on it. What are we going to do? Well, with the signing of the Constitution, we lost our democracy. I mean, that has always been a problem. of certain people, and it started out with well-to-do white men, wanting to have it for themselves. And if that language was ever going to be real, it's had to be made real by the people who were left out, because those folks at the beginning weren't going to wake up one day and say, oh my God, we forgot to free the slaves. We forgot to give free black people rights. We forgot to give rights to indigenous people. We forgot to give rights to women. That wasn't going to happen. It was only going to happen, and this has been proved by our history, by those people who were left out doing it themselves and demanding those rights. So in a sense, I think if you could say, if you could ever say that a country has nobility, where we find that nobility is in the people who insist that the country live up to its own ideals. And for me, these become the noblest of citizens because they demand that of all of us. So here are two of them that underline that behavior and that point of view. In Frederick Douglass, let me just say one quick thing about him. I read an article in the New Yorker a couple years ago that was kind of arguing about whether who was our greatest American, whether it was Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass. And it came down at the end to thinking that maybe Frederick Douglass was that person because of where he came from and then what he achieved. It's a hard call, but I mean, and I don't even know if I would agree with it, but he certainly is an extraordinary, extraordinary person. And I think, often you can look, and I'm going to say something about this a little bit later, that you can look at various moments in our history, single moments, and think, if that had changed, just that moment had changed, our history would be entirely different. When Frederick Douglass, was 17 years old and was a, uppity young slave and was given by his owner to what was called a slave breaker. A slave breaker, this man was named Edward Covey. His job was to take young slaves who still had some spirit, some self-respect, some desire to be a decent and strong individual person, and break their spirit by beating them repeatedly, just over and over again. And whenever they showed any sign of, getting up and wanting to, act like they had some self-respect, you beat them again. When Frederick Douglass was 17, this man, Edward Covey, had been beating him, and he was, as he says in his autobiography, on the point of just saying, I give up. I don't care anymore. I just, stop this. I'll do whatever you want. And he decided not to. And he got up and he beat Edward Covey, into submission himself. He actually beat him up. And that moment, changed Frederick Douglass's life and changed the history of this country, because of what happened then. Because he escaped, he became, the person he was, speaking then the greatest orator of the 19th century about women's rights, about abolition of slavery, about, racism and stuff, all over this country. An international figure. And our country, in some ways, hinged on that moment, which is so interesting. That moment of desperate courage on his part. I want to say, by the way, this isn't the quote that's on his picture, but he said one time, and this to me is, one of the most important things that we could possibly say to ourselves or to each other about what it means to be a citizen in a democratic society. He said, find out what any people in any country under any form of government, find out what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong that will be imposed on them. Whatever you submit to will be imposed on you. That couldn't be clearer today, and luckily there's a lot of resistance to what's going on. Maybe not enough, but a lot of it. And I want to say something about Helen Keller. I mean, you all know who she is. What you may not know is how political she was and how strongly she was a dedicated socialist for all the right reasons one would want to be a socialist. But she said one time, when talking about politics, he said, when you come to think of it, there are no such things as divine, immutable, or inalienable rights. In other words, she was saying the Declaration of Independence, it's a piece of paper. You know, it doesn't really mean anything. There are no such things as divine, immutable, or inalienable rights. Rights are things, she said, that you get when you make good your claim on them. And it's basically the same thing that Frederick Douglass was saying. You know, in order to have these freedoms, the rights, you know, that they demand of us an enormous responsibility to make sure that they happen. You know, they happen not just for us, but for other people, other generations, and for all other living things. You know, that is the responsibility of a democratic society. Is not that we, you know, sit back and expect that because of our documents and our system that it's going to reward us and we're all going to live happily ever after. As we know, and all should know, just from looking at our history, it's quite the opposite. You know, as soon as you relax and allow other people to start chipping away and taking away these rights, they will take them away. And they will make it harder and harder to get them back. So here are two of my favorite people. One you all know, James Baldwin. A couple years ago, I gave myself a big treat, and I couldn't recommend it more. If you want to really understand this country's history, and especially its relationship with race, read the essays of James Baldwin again. They are so brilliant, so inviting. You know, he doesn't write from a position of rage and anger and punishment. He writes from a sense of inquiry into who are we? How did we get like this? You know, how is it that, you know, you are my sister and I'm your brother and we treat each other like this? You know, how can that be changed? And it's so amazing to read his words. The other one is a man named Oren Lyons, who is still living. He is the faith keeper of the Onondaga Nation, you know, one of the tribes of the Iroquois Nation. And they are the one tribe that has decided to try to live by their original beliefs and customs and not by, you know, building a casino or something like that. And they are very successful at doing that, and he is their faith keeper. And he said, going to meet him in Syracuse one time, I learned a ton from him. But one of the things that he said, which was, I think, so important, was that he said, and I was shocked when he said this, he said, you know, when you people, you know, meaning all of us, he said, when you people decided to separate church and state, we knew, meaning indigenous people of the past, indigenous people of the future, we knew that it would only lead to disaster. And I looked at it and said, Oren, what are you talking about? You know, that's so important, the idea, you know, in terms of, you know, who is allowed to, you know, create the rules by which we live? You know, do we turn it over to some, you know, religious sect? And, you know, he said, no, that's not what I mean. He said, for us, your deepest reality has to be the source of your deepest spirituality. And that is nature. And when you wrote your Constitution and you separated the responsibility of your corporations, your organizations, from its tie to nature, to that deep, deep reality, we knew that you had separated church and state because that was your church. That was your salvation. That was the thing that was going to enable you to live on this planet forever, is your relationship with your spiritual relation to that reality. And when you separated that and acted like it didn't matter, we knew it would only be a disaster. So here's a really interesting, one thing that this project has done for me is just told me stories. I mean, with these 260 plus portraits now, I did not find all these people by myself. I get an enormous amount of help that comes in the form of emails and calls and things. I mean, practically every single day. Somebody's telling me, wow, have you heard about Barbara Johns? You know, why haven't you painted Barbara Johns? And who's Barbara Johns? You know, I had a show, there's a little museum in Washington, D.C. called the Sewell Belmont House, which is dedicated to the women's suffrage movement. And they had a show of these portraits there, and after I'd spoken, this group of women from Virginia came up and said, we'd like you to have you paint somebody from Virginia. I said, oh, great, well, give me some nominations. And they sent me a letter that had this girl's name on it. I had never heard this story, but it's actually a key story in this country's racial history. In 1951, Barbara Johns was a black girl going to a high school, the Moton High School in Farmville, Virginia, you know, a little community in sort of, where is it, southwestern Virginia. And that school was, as they said, separate and extremely unequal. I mean, it had no heat, it had no library, it had broken down buses as classrooms, it had twice the number of kids that the school was built for. You know, everything was bad about it, and they had to walk past the white school, which was like a country club by comparison, in order to get to Moton High School. And Barbara, who was very smart and 16 years old and knew that probably that her success in life would depend on the quality of the education she got, decided she would just do something about that. And so she got this idea, and she told a couple of people who were on the student council with her, swore them to secrecy, that she had an idea about how she was gonna change the situation. So one day she called up the principal and said, and disguised her voice and said to him that some kids from Moton, I mean black kids, were down in the white section of town and they were raising hell, and that he better get down there and do something about it. And of course, this is something that the black community did not want to have happen. So he got in his car and he left the school. Then she passed out all these notices to all the teachers in the school, in all the classrooms. It said there was going to be an emergency meeting right away in this place. I don't even know how they had the meeting, because there was no cafeteria. Somehow they all got together. 450 kids and the teachers, everybody wondering what this is about. And Barbara stands up and says, we're going to do something about education in this school. We're all being cheated, not only of education, but we're cheated out of our future. And so I'm going to walk out of the school right now and walk to the superintendent, a white guy, and demand not an integrated school, but a separate and truly equal school, just like the Constitution says. That's what I want. And I want you all to come with me. 450 kids walked out of that school. They walked to the superintendent. Barbara, demanded that they be given a better school. He refused, of course, and said, you kids better go back to school or you'll all be suspended, and your parents will lose their jobs, which was a very common thing to be done as a tactic in the civil rights era. Black people who spoke out lost their jobs before they lost everything else. So, and then Barbara said to him, no, that's not the way it's going to work. We're going to go on strike, until you give us a better school. So the kids struck the school, and the parents got behind them. This was the first time parents in the history of the civil rights movement, a community, had made a community-wide civil rights action. Well, some black lawyers in Richmond heard about what was going on in Farmville, and they came there, and they went not to the principal, not to the teachers, not to the parents, they went to the girl. Barbara, what do you want? And she explained what she wanted, and she said, well, we'll take this as a case, but we think it ought to be about integration, because you're not going to ever get an equal school in this country if it's just about, separate and equal also. And she said, okay, let's do that. Well, of course, the Klan then burned crosses on her yard, all this stuff happened. That case stayed in the courts for 3 years, and then became one of the 5 cases of Brown versus Board. It started with a 16-year-old girl, demanding that this change be made. I mean, one of the things that's been revealed to me as I've gone along painting these portraits is that this is not uncommon. There are many, many great moments in this country that have hinged on young people, people not old enough to vote, demanding that things change. What I didn't know at this time was here I didn't know the story of Barbara Johns. I also didn't know all the backstory. There was an enormous amount of other stuff. As you start to look into these stories, you realize that nothing just comes out of nowhere, and especially Brown versus Board. And what had happened there was that this man, Charles Hamilton Houston, who had founded the law school at Howard, he had been trying, or had the idea since the 1920s, that the way this race was going to change in this country was going to happen through something like Brown versus Board. It was going to have to begin in education, it was going to have to be integrated schools, and it was going to have to happen that way, and that the law would be the main avenue for this change to happen. He had begun bringing to the Supreme Court in the 1930s cases that demanded integration of schools. And the way he did it was so clever. You know, there were a lot of states who didn't allow any race mixing in schools at all, of course, in the South and even in the North. But what he did was, since the Constitution said separate but equal, he would find a graduate of a black college who wanted to go to graduate school, and of course there was no graduate school for a black student. So he would petition to have that student admitted to a white graduate school. And he won all these cases where several states, Missouri, Maryland, Texas, and several others, thought that in order to deal with this case, they would actually open a graduate school for one student. And then they realized that that's not going to work. They just couldn't afford that. So what they would do was actually integrate their graduate school. And he had won all these cases that were leading toward being able to argue the Brown versus Board case. He died of a heart attack in 1950. His student was Thurgood Marshall. And you wonder where Thurgood Marshall came from and how he happened to be the one who argued that case. Well, there he was. He was his student. And the two lawyers in Richmond, Spotswood Robinson and Oliver Hill, who had heard about Barbara Johns and had come to Farmville, they were classmates of Thurgood Marshall. They had been all together looking for cases like this. They had already planned this. And then all of a sudden there was Barbara, with this incredible courage and determination to get a good education. And it was just what they needed. So here's a guy that, there are a lot of people who look at some of the portraits I painted and they say, whoa, you painted a traitor? This is a really interesting case, and I want to explain why I did this. I started painting him. I suppose a lot of you can probably remember the day that we first started hearing about Edward Snowden. He was holed up in a hotel room in Hong Kong, being interviewed by a couple of journalists, Glenn Greenwald and Lisa Poitras. And we actually heard what he was saying, and there were written documents. The next day, I started looking at images on the internet from that interview and started painting this portrait. I knew immediately how important this was and what he was trying to do. Several years before this, I'd painted a man named Tom Drake, who was a top executive at the NSA, who had tried to blow the whistle on the illegal wiretapping that they were doing, along with some other illegal things in terms of business that they were doing. And he was charged with the Espionage Act, Tom Drake. And you never heard of him. He disappeared for the most part because, in order to, the government and the news media just didn't talk about him. And the situation didn't go away, though. It got, not only did it remain, but it got worse, in terms of data collection of everybody. Our emails, our calls, anything could be collected. This was completely illegal, And Edward Snowden saw what happened to Thomas Drake. And he thought the American people have got to know this stuff. They've got to know what's being done to them. And he realized that in order to do this, Tom Drake had gone through the steps that Edward Snowden was told, oh, you should have gone through the accepted ways of reporting, and then, to first your bosses, and then these committees, and then to Congress, blah, blah, blah. Tom Drake did all that and then disappeared. Anyway, so Snowden realized that the people needed to know this information. And so he was going to have to find another way to do it. And, this message was so simple and so important, because, we say that a government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. What does that mean if you don't know what they're doing? It means we've all been manipulated. We've all been bamboozled, and we've all been treated like children. It's, in effect, it's saying there are people, in our government, in our intelligence agencies, who are much, much smarter than all of us. They know, things, and shouldn't be the only ones who know things, that allow them to do whatever they want to do, and we don't need to know about it. We shouldn't know about it because we're not wise enough, or whatever it is, to know these things. But we're still supposed to trust them enough that we can still call ourselves a democracy and give over power to this organization we call our government, and that's good because they then have just power even though we don't know what they're doing. Well, obviously this is a total subversion of the idea of what a democratic government is. I mean, there's also something exceedingly simple here, and this is also something that Snowden said. If you think that you're going to be more secure, if that's your primary goal, is to be secure all the time in the most possible ways you can. If you think that you're going to be more secure if the government collects all this data about you all the time without you knowing about it, if you think so, let's have a vote. Let's do the democratic thing. Let's decide as adults if that's the way we want to live. Treat ourselves and treat the government as adult people, who look at a problem like that about security and then decide, what do we want? Is that the way we want to live? Where we have Big Brother there in all of our business all the time in secret? Because we can decide that ourselves, We're grown-up people. It's a very simple thing. And I think that man, had enormous courage to try to make that very simple point, to all of us. And instead, of course, he was branded as a traitor and, it's a terrible person and, person should have been, people called for his head. He was actually demanding a mature democratic response from this country. So here's another stories, things that you come across that are, everybody knows who Rosa Parks is, of course. I was 9 years old in 1955, growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, when Rosa Parks sat on that bus. And I remember being told that the reason she sat there was because she was tired. Her feet hurt from working all day. And I suspect that there are people here who've heard that same story. And you can still go into schools in this country and ask, well, why did she do it? And kids will say, oh, she was tired. Her response to that was, the only tired I was tired of giving in. But it's interesting because that was immediately the story that white people told themselves about what she had done. When you say that the reason she chose to be arrested rather than move 10 feet to the back of the bus was that she was tired and her feet hurt, her courage is totally stripped from her. Instead, she's kind of a pathetic person, a person who just would get arrested just because her feet hurt. Anyways, instead, of course, what she was doing was, a very simple and profound act of civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is often the thing which actually supports this country's democracy more than almost any other thing, sometimes more than voting. And she was, her point was to get, not to get in jail, but to get in front of a judge and say, hey, judge, it's not that I'm a bad person breaking a good law. I'm a good person breaking a bad law. Change the law. That was all she wanted to do. And she had been trained at the Highlander Center in Tennessee to be able to live through the stress of doing what she's doing. Because, this is Montgomery in 1955. She could have been killed. She could have been lynched. Her house, her church, everything could have been blown up. Those were the things that were happening, right? It would be not unusual or surprising if any of those things happened to her. One interesting thing about this case is that it wasn't the first time it happened. Women, and it's curious that it's women, almost always women, going back 70 years, had been doing this on trains and buses in this country. This was the first time we really heard about it. That was a surprising thing. Ida B. Wells had done it on a train back in the 1880s, I think. Anyways, next to her is Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin, 9 months before Rosa Parks, in the same city, Montgomery, Alabama, was a high school kid who had taken, they then had the Negro History Week, not Black History Month, Negro History Week. And in her black school, they had been teaching about, great black figures. And so 9 months before Rosa Parks, she's sitting, just like Rosa Parks, in the first row of the black section of the bus. The white section filled up, and she was told to go stand in the back of the bus. One little interesting note here is that next to her on that, the aisle across from her on the bus was an empty seat. the white person could have sat down in the empty seat, but the law in Montgomery said that that was illegal because it implied equality. So she had to get up and move. And she said, this 15-year-old kid with no training at all, like Rosa Parks, said, "I'm not moving. The Constitution allows me to sit here." When I'm talking to kids, I try to ask them to think about, how do you think that went over on that bus? You know, what happened in the front of the bus? What happened in the back of the bus? You know, how did that, what was being said? What was the interaction like? I mean, just think about that. I mean, you can imagine that white people were saying to her, and you can imagine how terrified people in the back of the bus were that she was not going to move, you know, and then what might happen? This is a very scary moment. And they, you know, the bus driver, they didn't have cell phones. They had to stop the bus, and, you know, find a phone, call the police. The police dragged her off the bus the whole time she's saying, "The Constitution allows me to sit here." The case that went to the Supreme Court that ended bus segregation in Montgomery was not Rosa Parks' case. It was Claudette Colvin's case, a 15-year-old kid. She said years later, when a book about her was written, and it won the National Book Award, and she was invited to be there as a 70-year-old woman, you know, all the reporters ran up to her afterwards and said, "Claudette, why didn't you move? Why didn't you move? And surely your parents had told you, don't do that." Just like parents today tell black kids, don't argue with the cops, you know. They had said, you know, if there's a confrontation like that, just walk away. Your life is far more important. You know, and she said, "I tried to move. I wanted to move. I tried to stand up, and I felt Harriet Tubman's hand on my shoulder, pushing me back down. And then I tried again, and Sojourner Truth was pushing me back down." And she said, I had to ask myself then, what would those women do? There was only one answer, you know, and that's why she sat there. I mean, in a sense, that is the reason for this project, you know, is to give us all, you know, these models of courage at the moment. We all run into moments like that, where we have choices between doing something that's, you know, a compromise with our conscience and walking away from a situation, or standing up to it. You know, who are our models? And if we have no models, it's very hard. If we're all alone at that moment, reinventing what it means to be courageous, you know, and stand up for something in the society. But when your head and your heart are full of people who have done that, and you admire them and you want to be in their company, it's a whole lot easier, even though you pay for it a lot of times. This is, I've painted a lot of indigenous people. Do you all know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Maine? And maybe Denise Altvater has even been here in this church, I don't know. But she was one of the women who started that project, who had herself been taken out of her home on an Indian reservation and forcibly put in white homes in Old Town, Maine, in order to be civilized, so she wouldn't grow up, you know, on an Indian reservation in an indigenous home. And her life was forever changed and traumatized by what was done to her. And she has suffered enormously, psychologically and emotionally, from that trauma. However, you know, she then went and studied in Greensboro, North Carolina, with people from South Africa who came to talk about how you could do a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and she was one of the women, along with Esther Atian, who's now Esther Ann, who I also painted, who started that commission and tried to get the word out around the state about what it was like to be an indigenous person, what this history was, you know, the whole history of these, schools that were, you know, where kids were taken off the reservation, out of homes, and then put in these schools and not allowed to speak their own languages and forced into assimilation of a sort. Anyway, it's one of the darkest parts of our own history, and this is one of the people who's paid an enormous price for it and then tried to turn it around and heal not just herself and her people, but all of us, because we're all part of that same trauma, whether we realize it or not. tomorrow, Saturday, when this film plays at the Alamo, there are going to be several people I painted there, including Tim DeChristopher. I should say that there are a couple people in this audience right now whom I painted. Hal Crowther is sitting right there, the great journalist. Peter Davis is sitting back there, great filmmaker, writer, et cetera, et cetera. Both of them I painted years ago and have been huge inspirations to me and I hope to all of us. You know, I read one of Hal's essays recently where he said that Trump's brain, I may not have this quite right, is a very small place where facts go to die. I thought, what a great description of Trump's brain. You know, unfortunately, it describes a bigger brain, which might be this country, you know, where we often try to operate with a kind of amnesia, where we don't like to entertain or allow to live the facts of our own history. And you know, Trump's just the worst incarnation of what that can look like. I realize what time it is. I'm going to say quickly something about him. At the end of the Bush administration, George Bush administration, in 2008, he wanted to do something for his buddies in the fossil fuel industry. And that was open up southern Utah, that beautiful, delicate, fragile area where the Arches Park is and all that stuff, to you know, exploration for coal, oil, and gas. Just the exploration would damage this environment enormously. Tim DeChristopher was a student at the University of Utah in Salt Lake, taking an economics class. And he heard about this. His professor said that this auction was going to happen. And Tim was already an environmentalist, and he was outraged. This was the area that he liked to hike in. It was his spiritual home. And he thought that he was going to find out where this meeting was, where this auction was taking place, and just try to disrupt it. You know, go there and, I don't know, yell and scream, jump up and down, you know, try to do something just to bring attention, say, I know what you're doing in there. Well, he found out where it was, some fancy space in a hotel, walked to the door, and the fossil fuel people assumed that anybody who came there was in on it. They knew where this meeting was, and they were representing some company. And they said to him, are you here to bid? And they handed him, you know, a bidding paddle, number 70. And so he got in, which was totally surprising to him. And then he saw something that further disgusted him, was that all these big companies that were there bidding on this land were acquiring this beautiful, priceless land for $2 an acre, $2.50 an acre, you know, $3 an acre. And they weren't bidding against each other. And it was very clear that they had all colluded. They'd gotten together beforehand and decided who would get what. And so they were just letting people take the land they wanted, spending absolutely no money at all, you know, and then getting this priceless land. He was in a rage. He was penniless. He started bidding. He bid $22 million to buy land, thousands and thousands of acres he bought, and then the people who were running this meeting realized something was wrong here. And they arrested him, you know, for fraud. And his case stayed in the courts for a couple of years, and then he was sentenced to prison for 2 years. The oil and gas companies that had defrauded the public by colluding about this whole thing paid no price at all. Nobody charged them with anything, you know. He went to prison for 2 years, and then while he was in prison, Harvard Divinity School gave him a full scholarship, where he went when he got out. And he will be here. He's now working on a organic farm down in the Camden area. And he will be here. Sherry Mitchell, who I've also painted, I'm sure a lot of you know Sherry Mitchell. She'll be there on Saturday too. Zoe Weil, the great educator who I painted, she'll be there too. So anyway, this story about, you know, sometimes what it takes, you know, to resist, you know, a terrible situation, the price that a person can pay. But the Interior Department took the land off the market. The land was saved, even though he spent that time in prison. And that's, you know, was his goal. I mean, sometimes that's what this kind of civil disobedience leads to. I just want to say something about art. This is Lily Yeh. We've had her here a couple of times in this area. We brought her up here. She's an artist who uses art to rebuild broken communities in various places in the world, sometimes the worst of the worst. You know, and what she sees is that when people have lost all hope and think that you know, nothing is going to change and nobody cares about them, and they have lost all their self-respect and have no gumption to do anything to make their lives better, she will go into a community and start working with the children, knowing that it's probably the children who still have the spirit of life in them. And she asks them to make art with her. And then she takes their art and turns it into murals and sculptures and monumental forms that change the character of the decrepit situation that the people live in. And when they see themselves, in a sense, reborn through their own children's spirit, she then uses various forms of economic development to rebuild their economy. You know, I've gone with her to a village of the survivors of genocide in Rwanda. I went twice to the West Bank, to Palestinian refugee camps, and was just amazed at what she does and how she does it, and how people respond to her, how they, you know, are filled with a new spirit of wanting to live good lives for themselves and for everybody else in the community. It's so interesting, you know, what art can do at times, you know. And she, this little tiny Chinese woman, you know, goes in and changes people's lives just basically with their own art, you know, not even realizing that they have that in them. I got anything else on here? No, I think that was the last one. I guess I wanted to end on that note about art. But anyway, I want to thank you so much for this. If you are interested in, you know, more about this, you know, the Americans Who Tell the Truth website is americanswhotellthetruth.org, that has 260 some portraits on it. It has, under every portrait, there's a biography. There are the educational connections, you know, talks about all the stuff we can do, ways to support our project. We always need support because of the educational work we're trying to do. And now I just want, last thing I want to do is just mention who my friends are I brought here today with me. Up here, this is Dawn Wooten. About 3 weeks ago, this film that's playing at the Alamo on Saturday played at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. And we brought Dawn Wooten from Tifton, Georgia, to unveil her portrait in the portrait gallery. She was a nurse at the Irwin County Detention Center, Immigrant Detention Center, where terrible abuse was being done to women. Everybody realized it. Nobody did anything about it. And she realized that if she didn't speak up, that these women who were being so abused, forcibly sterilized, and all kinds of other things, if she didn't speak up and do something about it, these women had no voice at all. And even though she realized that to blow the whistle there was going to mean that probably she would lose her job, she's a single mom with 5 kids, that, you know, she would pay a big social price, an economic price for doing that. She realized she had to do it, and she did it. That detention center is now closed. I mean, it's just an incredible story where she came from. I mean, it's worth going to the website and reading the story about her and what she accomplished by doing that, and is still accomplishing. This is Jasa Hunter Mellors. She's Jasa Hunter Mellors became an activist at the age of 10 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I painted her when she was 16, just this year. These are all brand new portraits. She was suffering, as many people in her black community were suffering, from all kinds of environmental sicknesses. She had terrible asthma. She'd almost died of it. People had other, you know, cancers and other diseases from, I mean, you know, this is one of those situations of, you know, what we call environmental racism, where all the most dangerous and polluting, you know, businesses, plants, and everything were put right in that community. And she became the spokesman for the group trying to close the age of 10 for the coal-fired power plant. And they won. They did it, you know, and that was, you know, just this amazing thing that often, you know, it's that kid out in front speaking her truth about what's wrong with the situation and how she has paid a price for it and what it's doing to other people that becomes the factor that other people, adult people, you know, have to deal with then. And that's who she is. This is Shannon Watts. Some of you may, if any of you are members of Moms Demand Action, You know, the group that started right after that horrible shooting in Connecticut. I can't think of Sandy Hook. She didn't live in Sandy Hook, but she was so outraged by that she realized that she had to do something. And she now has a group that has 6 million volunteers in every state in the country that are doing all kinds of grassroots work to try to change our gun laws. I mean, this is obviously an enormous task that we need enormous help trying to do. But her organization and her willingness to engage at that level and continue for all this time has been extraordinary. I mean, I don't know if you noticed, you know, after all these shootings, you turn on CNN or MSNBC, and she's always there, you know, the one that they go to talk about this. Stephen Donziger is a lawyer from New York. 30 years ago, he took the case of indigenous people in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Chevron had been exploring for oil there and had taken an enormous amount of oil, and all of their toxic byproducts they were dumping in the forest, just dumping them. And they were poisoning huge amounts of the Amazon and making, I forget what it is, 5 or 10 different tribes were disastrously sick because all of their water, the animals, the plants, everything was poisoned by what Chevron did. He went there and took their case, and in the Ecuadorian courts won a $9 billion settlement against Chevron to clean it up. Chevron didn't clean it up. They closed their offices in Ecuador and left the country. And then they decided to deal with this by attacking him. He has been under house arrest in New York for 2.5 years, finally been released. I mean, it's just the bizarre Kafkaesque nature of his struggle against trying to tell the truth about what Chevron did against a court system that was bought by Chevron Power. They had 2,000 lawyers working against him to make sure that this did not happen, that they did not have to pay that money. I mean, they must have almost ended up spending the $9 billion on legal fees, you know, but they did not want to concede that they had done this terrible thing in Ecuador. I mean, that's the nature of what we're up against now when we think about fossil fuels and you know, whether we're really going to be able to do enough to you know, save this planet. And then some of you, I guess, probably better than I, know who Henry Wallace is. You know, I read a book by John Nichols a year or so ago about Henry Wallace. And this is another moment in our history, like the moment I talked about with Frederick Douglass, where he fought back and changed history just by that one person doing that. You know, Henry Wallace, after he was Secretary of Agriculture under FDR, was the vice president in 1940. And then he was, you know, everybody knew that FDR might not survive another presidency. But they reelected him, and it was assumed that by the Democratic Party at that time that, you know, who they had as their vice president was really, really important. And they decided they didn't want Henry Wallace because he was too progressive. He was too outspoken about racism in this country. He was too outspoken about American Nazism, which he had been talking about all over the country. He was too outspoken about wealth disparity. He was way too beyond where, you know, the Democratic Party wanted to go. So they had him removed, and Truman put on the ticket. That's why we got Truman, is, you know, to make sure that we didn't get Henry Wallace. And I think that, you know, after reading now a couple of biographies of him and a history about that time, is that was one of those moments where if, you know, he had been the vice president when FDR died in 1944, that this country would have been a very different place, because he was much more, even though he was castigated as being far too progressive and blah, 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 you know, all that stuff, he was so much closer to the ideals of this country than anybody else in government at that time, including FDR, that we could have had a very different future. He was also against the atomic bomb. He was, you know, again, he was all about making peace in the world instead of keeping us on a sort of wartime economy. A very different vision of what it takes to live in a sane and democratic world. Anyways, I would love to answer a couple questions if you got some, but thank you so much for listening to me talk about this.
Oh, this takes a little while to come on. Any questions in the audience?
Or suggestions?
All right. Well, we are going to have a little reception here in the parish hall. Rob will be in there. You can ask your questions privately there, and he'll be signing and selling copies of his book. We can't thank you enough for this talk. It was wonderful.
Oh, thank you, Lisa.
And
Thank
yes.
you very much.
And with that, we'll close the annual meeting. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Right, yeah. Thank you.
This new world of, like, I would have had to run into the audience.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And we do have a thank you.
Oh,
Thank you for
thank you.
doing this. We really, really appreciate it.
Oh, good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, looking forward to Saturday.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that should be fun. Yeah.